The chair was the only thing I bought that day, and the moment I handed the woman $5 for it, she covered her face and started sobbing. I thought I had accidentally hurt her feelings, until she whispered, "You don't understand, that chair is the last thing he ever built for me." Then she looked at the empty house behind her and added, "And now you're the first person who has wanted something from this house without wanting to take something from me." Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. I had driven past the yard sale 3 times before finally pulling over. It was a bright Saturday morning in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of morning when the sidewalks were warm beneath the sun and every lawn seemed freshly cut. A handwritten sign near the curb said everything must go, and beneath it, in smaller letters, was written "Please don't ask why." That last sentence stayed in my mind. I had never seen a yard sale sign like that before. Usually people wanted you to know why they were moving, downsizing, remodeling, or cleaning out a garage. This woman seemed to be begging strangers not to ask questions. Her name, I would later learn, was Elara Whitmore. At that moment, all I knew was that she looked exhausted. She was probably in her early 60s, with silver beginning to show through dark brown hair pulled loosely behind her neck. She wore an old blue cardigan despite the warmth, and every few minutes she would glance toward the house as if expecting someone to walk out of it. But no one did. The house itself looked strangely hollow. The windows were bare. The porch had no flower pots. Even the curtains had been removed from several rooms. It didn't look like someone was having a yard sale. It looked like someone was erasing a life. I wandered between folding tables covered with ordinary things, dishes, books, picture frames, gardening tools, old lamps, Christmas decorations, children's toys, and boxes of clothes. None of it seemed valuable. Yet Elara handled each object with an odd kind of caution, as though every item had once meant something. I watched her pick up a chipped ceramic mug, stare at the faded lettering on it, and then quietly place it into a cardboard box marked "Sold." A minute later, she picked up a framed photograph, looked at it for several seconds, and turned it face down. That's when I saw the chair. It sat near the garage beneath a small maple tree, separated from everything else. It was an old wooden rocking chair with worn arms and a seat polished smooth by years of use. The varnish had faded in places, and one of the wooden spindles had been repaired with a careful, almost invisible piece of dowel. It wasn't beautiful in the way expensive furniture was beautiful. It was beautiful because somebody had loved it. I ran my fingers along the armrest and noticed tiny scratches carved into the wood. Some looked like initials. Others looked like measurements or dates. On the underside of the seat was a small brass plate, nearly hidden beneath layers of dust. It read, "Handmade for E.W., 1987. How much for the chair?" I asked. Elara froze. For a second, she didn't answer. She stared at my hand resting on the armrest, then looked toward the house. $5, she finally said. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a $10 bill. "Keep the change." Her expression changed instantly. She shook her head. "No. 5. I tried to laugh gently, thinking maybe she was just being particular. "It's worth more than that." "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." I handed her the $5. And she began to cry. Not the quiet kind of crying people do when they want sympathy. Her shoulders trembled. She turned away from me and pressed both hands against her face, trying desperately to regain control. I stood there completely confused, still holding the receipt she had scribbled on a scrap of paper. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to upset you. I can put it back." She lowered her hands and looked at me with tears running down her cheeks. "No. Please don't. Then she touched the chair as though saying goodbye to a person. My husband made that, she whispered. He died 6 weeks ago. I didn't know what to say. Her eyes moved toward the empty house again. His name was Warren. There was something in her voice that made me stay. Elara told me Warren had built the chair 39 years earlier, when they were newly married and living in a tiny apartment with almost no money. She had been pregnant with their first child, and Warren had promised her that someday they would have a house with a porch, a garden, and enough room for their family. He couldn't afford to buy me anything, she said, wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of her cardigan. So he built me that chair. She smiled for the first time, but it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. He worked on it after his shift at the factory. He'd come home smelling like metal and sawdust. He'd tell me not to look because he wanted it to be a surprise. I looked at the chair differently. For 39 years, Elara had rocked in it. She had rocked their children in it. She had sat there during winter mornings with a cup of coffee. She had probably watched birthday candles being blown out from that porch. She had probably cried there too. Then she told me something I wasn't expecting. For the last 2 years, she said, Warren sat in that chair every afternoon. She paused. He had a bad heart. Toward the end, he couldn't walk very far. So I'd bring him out here, and we'd sit together. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. She looked down at the $5 in her palm. The last afternoon, he held my hand and told me something I didn't understand. What did he say? I asked. Elara swallowed hard. He said, don't keep the house just because you're afraid to let me go. I felt a chill despite the warm morning. Elara had decided to sell the house. But she hadn't told anyone why. As she began loading boxes into her car, I noticed a young man standing across the street. He was watching us. He looked angry. He was perhaps in his 30s, wearing work boots and a gray t-shirt. When Elara saw him, her entire body stiffened. He crossed the street. Mom, he said. Elara immediately looked away. The young man glanced at the chair in my hands and frowned. You sold Dad's chair? I sold a chair, she replied. That wasn't just a chair. I know. His jaw tightened. You said you weren't going to sell anything that belonged to him. I changed my mind. He looked at me, then back at her. You've changed your mind about everything lately. I expected Elara to argue, but instead she lowered her eyes. The man walked away. I learned his name was Mason, Warren and Elara's only surviving child. Their daughter, Tessa, had died at 19 in a car accident many years earlier. Mason had never forgiven himself for not being there that day, and Elara had never forgiven herself for something she refused to explain. That was the first secret. The second came when Mason returned later that afternoon. He approached me while I was carrying the chair toward my truck. Don't take that, he said. I stopped. Why? Because my mother doesn't know what she's doing. I glanced toward Elara. She was inside the house. Mason lowered his voice. She hasn't been herself since Dad died. She seems like she's grieving. You don't understand. No, I admitted. I don't. He stared at the chair. Dad built that for her. He wanted it buried with her. I frowned. What? Mason looked embarrassed by his own words. I mean, he told me once that if Mom ever sold the house, I should make sure she kept that chair. I looked toward the doorway. Then why did she sell it? He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, how much did you pay? $5. He gave a bitter laugh. My mother has been giving things away for months. Furniture. Jewelry. Family photographs. She even sold Dad's wedding ring. That stopped me. Why? Because she thinks she doesn't deserve any of it. I didn't know what he meant. Then Mason told me what had happened after Tessa's death. For years, Elara had believed she was responsible. Tessa had called her that afternoon. She had been upset because Elara had refused to let her borrow the family car. Tessa had left in anger, riding with a friend instead. The car had crashed during heavy rain. Elara had spent 24 years believing that if she had simply said yes, Tessa would still be alive. But Dad knew Mom was destroying herself, Mason said. He spent years trying to convince her it wasn't her fault. And now he's gone, I said. Mason nodded. And she thinks she has no reason to stay. That evening, I brought the chair home. But I couldn't stop thinking about Elara. The next morning, I returned to her house. The yard was nearly empty. The sale had ended. Elara was sitting on the porch steps, staring at the front door. I thought you might come back, she said. I sat beside her. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, "Did Mason tell you about Tessa?" "Yes." She closed her eyes. "I hated him for telling you. He didn't say anything cruel. He wasn't supposed to." She looked at me. I spent 24 years pretending I could change that day. I thought if I blamed myself enough, somehow it would mean Tessa hadn't died for nothing. Her voice broke. Warren spent 24 years trying to save me from that lie. Then she told me the part Mason didn't know. The afternoon Tessa died, she hadn't actually been angry with Elara because of the car. She had been planning to tell her mother that she was pregnant. The argument had been about something else entirely. She was going to come home that night, Elara whispered. She had bought a tiny yellow sweater for the baby. I felt my chest tighten. She never got to tell me. Elara had kept that sweater hidden for 24 years. She brought it out from a box in the garage. It was impossibly small. She placed it in my hands, then immediately pulled it back and pressed it against her chest. I kept thinking that if I had known, I would have hugged her differently. That sentence broke something inside me. She wasn't grieving only her daughter. She was grieving the last conversation they never had. Then Elara said something that changed everything. Warren knew. I looked at her. He knew Tessa was pregnant. How? Tessa told him first. I realized why Elara had sold everything. She wasn't simply emptying the house. She was trying to erase the evidence of a life she believed she had failed. The chair was part of that life. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the receipt. I want to give it back. She shook her head. No, you shouldn't lose it. I already lost everything. No, I said. You lost someone. That's different from losing everything. She stared at me. I continued, you still have Mason. You still have the house for now. You still have the memories. And you still have the chance to forgive yourself. She began crying again. But this time she didn't hide her face. A week later, Mason came to my house. He had a small envelope in his hand. Mom wants you to have this. Inside was a handwritten note from Warren. It had been taped beneath the seat of the rocking chair. I hadn't seen it because the paper was tucked into a narrow wooden compartment. The note said that if Elara ever sold the chair, it meant she was finally ready to let someone else carry a piece of their story. Then came the sentence none of us expected. Please remind her that love isn't measured by how long we keep the things that belong to the people we lost. Love is measured by what we do with the time we have left. Below that, Warren had written something about Mason. He said his son had spent too many years believing he had failed his sister, when in truth, Tessa had never blamed him for anything. Mason broke down when he read it. For years, he had believed that he should have been driving that night. But Warren had written that Tessa's friend had been driving. Mason had been working a shift at the restaurant and hadn't even known she was leaving. The guilt had never belonged to him. It had simply been handed down from one grieving person to another. That afternoon, Mason and I drove back to his mother's house with the chair in the truck. When Elara opened the door and saw it, she stopped breathing for a moment. "I thought you sold it," she whispered. "I did." "Then why is it here?" "Because I realized it was never really mine." Mason helped carry it onto the porch. Elara touched the wooden armrest. Then Mason knelt beside her. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking, "I need you to forgive me." She looked confused. "For what?" "For letting you believe you were alone." She began crying. He continued, "I was so angry after Tessa died that I forgot you lost her too." Elara reached for him. They held each other on that porch while I stood several feet away, watching two people finally put down a burden they had carried for decades. A month later, Elara didn't sell the house. She sold some furniture, donated many of the clothes, and gave away things she no longer needed. But she kept the photographs. She kept Tessa's yellow sweater. And she kept the chair. Every Saturday morning, Mason came over with groceries. Sometimes they cooked together. Sometimes they sat on the porch and said almost nothing. And sometimes, Elara rocked slowly in Warren's chair while reading the letters he had left behind. I thought that would be the end of the story. It wasn't. 3 months later, Elara called me. She asked if I could come by. When I arrived, there was a small wooden plaque attached to the chair. It read, "For Warren, who taught us that letting go is not the same as forgetting." Elara smiled. Then she handed me an envelope. Inside was my original $5 bill. "I can't take this," I said. "You can," she replied. "Because that $5 gave me something I couldn't buy." "What?" "A reason to stop running." She told me that after I bought the chair, she had finally opened Warren's desk drawer. Inside were dozens of letters he had written over the years but never given her. Some were about Tessa. Some were about Mason. Some were simply memories of ordinary days. One letter was dated 2 weeks before Warren died. In it, he wrote that he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid Elara would spend the rest of her life punishing herself for surviving him. That was the moment she finally understood. Moving forward wasn't betrayal. Laughing again wasn't betrayal. Keeping the chair wasn't betrayal. And letting someone else sit in it someday wouldn't mean Warren had been forgotten. It meant his love had outlived him. A year after that yard sale, Elara invited me to her porch for lunch. The chair sat beneath the maple tree. She had planted flowers around it. There was a photograph of Warren on the little table beside her. Mason was there too. And for the first time, Elara laughed when she told us a ridiculous story about Warren trying to assemble a barbecue grill without reading the instructions. The sound of her laughter felt almost sacred. Before I left, she touched the chair and said, "You know what I thought when you bought this?" "What?" "I thought you were taking away the last piece of my husband." She smiled through tears. "Instead, you reminded me that pieces of the people we love don't disappear. We carry them differently." I looked at that old chair, scratched and faded from 39 years of use, and realized why she had cried when I bought it. It wasn't because I had purchased something valuable. It was because, for the first time since Warren died, someone had touched something precious to her without trying to possess the story behind it. Sometimes kindness isn't about saving someone. Sometimes it's simply about sitting beside them while they remember how to save themselves. Speech balloon special request: before the story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in this situation? If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful and inspiring stories. Your support encourages us to keep creating stories that touch hearts around the world. I still have that $5 receipt. I keep it inside the drawer of my desk, not because the chair was worth $5, but because that little piece of paper reminds me of something I nearly forgot. We never really know what someone is carrying when we meet them. A stranger selling a chair might be selling a lifetime of memories. A person who looks angry might be drowning in grief. Someone who seems to have given up might only be waiting for one small reason to believe tomorrow is worth facing. Elara taught me that day that love doesn't end when someone leaves us. Sometimes it changes shape. Sometimes it becomes a photograph, a letter, a yellow sweater, a familiar song, or an old wooden chair beneath a tree. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to let another person help us carry the weight, grief slowly makes room for gratitude. Because the people we lose would never want our love for them to become a prison. They would want it to become a light. And sometimes, all it takes to turn that light back on is one ordinary act of kindness from a stranger who doesn't even realize how badly someone needed it. If you want, I can continue the story with a hopeful message about healing through kindness. Summarize key takeaways from this story about grief, forgiveness, and human connection. Explain in plain language why the chair symbolized more than just a chair in this story.